Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your Infinite Playa experience. Let's hope we can all get dusty together next year. My name is Stacia Butterfield, and I'm so excited to introduce you to one of my favorite people on the planet. Dr. Maria Vittoria Mangini is a founder of the Women's Visionary Council, a nonprofit organization that supports investigations into non-ordinary forms of consciousness and uh, organizes gatherings of researchers, healers, artists, and activists whose work explores these states. Her long history with the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic includes having been a barefoot patient, a lead clinician in the medical section, and the chair of the board of directors, all in the same lifetime. Maria has written extensively on the impact of psychedelic experiences in shaping the lives of her contemporaries and has worked closely with many of the most distinguished investigators in this field. She has been a family nurse midwife for 35 years and is in primary practice with Dr. Frank Lucido, one of the pioneers in the medical cannabis movement. Their practice was one of the first to implement the California Compassionate Use Act of 1996, which was the state's first cannabis initiative. Her current project is the development of a thanatology program for the study of death and dying. On a personal note, she has just lived an extraordinary life, and she has the wit, the charm, and the intelligence to synthesize just many of her life stories and adventures and perspectives into a wonderful experience for any of those lucky enough to uh, that she shares them with. So it is my honor, my privilege, and an absolute pleasure to introduce you to a true national treasure, Dr. Maria Mangini, presenting Dr. Destroyer, Diviner Delighter, Women and Sacred Plants.
Hello, my name is Maria Mangini. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Women's Visionary Council, and I'm going to give you a short talk on the history of women and sacred plants. I'm Maria Mangini. I'm one of the board members of the Women's Visionary Council, and the pattern that you see on the screen, which is also the logo for the Women's Visionary Council, represents the famous Lorentz equation that describes the nature of chaotic systems, here transformed into a beautiful real-life object by crocheting from computer-generated instructions. Together, all the stitches define a complicated surface called the Lorentz manifold, and the final result consists of more than 25,000 stitches and took 85 hours to produce. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to Cynthia Palmer and Michael Horowitz, pioneers in the field of psychedelic culture and the authors of two important books, Shaman Women, Mainline Lady, and Sisters of the Extreme. Cindy Palmer's talk at the first Women's Visionary Congress in 2007 inspired me to begin collecting the stories that are presented here. Cindy and Michael have generously allowed the WVC to use their images and their ideas about the role and history of women and non-ordinary states of consciousness as the foundation of our further work in this area and of this talk. The image of a woman in her garden is an archetype crossing all times and cultures. From early times, women have been associated with plants and plant life. They've tended and tasted, grown and sown. They've cultivated and accumulated vast plant wisdom. This connects Eve, Cleopatra, Maria Sabina, and Valerie Corral, all women wise in the ways of plants. The goddesses of myths and antiquity, as well as real women of the ancient world, were closely associated with sacred plants and embodied the powers of healers and seers. Wisdom, grace, access to visions, or even to the divine were some of the promises to the person who ate the fruits, berries, leaves, or roots, or drank a potion, or inhaled the smoke made from the dried leaves and herb combinations that they prepared. For centuries, wise women and healers understood the use of herbs for healing and for magical intent. Healing techniques were often passed down from mother to daughter. Gardens in ancient times were often surrounded by walls designed to keep out enemies, whether human or animal. During the medieval period, enclosed gardens took on symbolic meaning and were referred to as the hortus conclusus. They were seen as examples of paradise on earth in both Christian and Islamic traditions. Artists used the symbolism of the enclosed garden to portray love and religious ideals, and also as a symbol for the female body. In many cultures during this time, the enclosed garden represented domesticity, refinement, and femininity. And here we see the maiden placed in the garden while her suitor is still outside the wall. Herb gardens developed from general gardens of the ancient classical world. And during the medieval period, monks and nuns acquired herbal knowledge and grew necessary herbs for healing in specialized gardens, of which the witch's garden was an herb garden specifically designed and used for the cultivation of magical and medicinal herbs. There's an abundance of historic images depicting women with plants, as well as potions derived from them, which appear on wall friezes, crockery, in tapestries, and in other art forms. They cover all facets of the meaning of the Greek word pharmakon, which was used in many ways, just as we use the word drug, to mean a healing medicine, as seen here, a magic potion, such as a love philter, or a dangerous poison. A central religious myth of the West is the story of Eve, the first woman who was tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden, leading to the first drug bust. In a sanctuary in Crete around 1400 BC, there is the poppy goddess. She is wearing a headdress of poppies in which ripe capsules show that the women of Crete knew about the cultivation and use of opium. If you look closely, you'll see that the poppy capsules are scored to extract the opium before the pods open. The use of potions or filters for magical and religious purposes was relatively common in Greece and the ancient world. This is Demeter, the grain goddess, depicted here holding poppies, barley, and snakes. She's the central figure of the Eleusinian mystery rites, at which a potion called the kykeon was ingested in a 10-day ceremony at the Temple of Eleusis outside of Athens. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a mass religious event that took place every year, in which a sacred brew was drunk by initiates in a ritual setting. There's a lot of speculation as to what the contents of the kykeon might have been, and some scholars believe that it may have been a psychedelic agent. The rites of Demeter had an incredible importance for those who participated in them, and the kykeon was the key which opened the minds of people to the secrets of their gods. Demeter was often called Erysibe, the Greek word for ergot, and her special color was purple, seen here as the color of the Claviceps purpurea fungus, which can produce a psychoactive substance. Carl Ruck, a classicist from Boston University, wrote about the mysteries that the initiates often experienced visions of the congruity of the beginning and the end, of birth and death, of the totality and the eternal generative ground of being. It must have been an encounter with the ineffable and the divine. References to pharmacology in ancient Greek texts point to the important role of women in the creation of medicine and science. Long before Hippocrates, priestesses established colleges of healing, and potent drug mixtures containing substances derived from plants and snake toxins also were used as abortifacients, in painkillers and psychotropics, and for the general treatment of disease. The use of such preparations also permeates much of ancient myth. Here we see a bust of Sappho, one of the great poets of ancient Greece, and in this surviving fragment of one of her poems, she imagines the gods themselves getting high. Peace reigned in heaven. Ambrosia stood already mixed in the wine bowl, and it was Hermes who took up the jug and poured wine for the gods. It was a common practice for wine to be mixed with herbs in ancient Greece. It's said that psychotropic plants grew from the places where Helen of Troy's tears fell after she was abducted, the event which resulted in the Trojan War. Here we see Helen with Telemachus weeping as her husband King Menelaus speaks of the exploits of his father. For his sorrow, Helen prepared the drink Nepenthe. Nepenthe was probably a form of opium, likely a mixture of opium and hypnotic plants such as mandrake, belladonna, and henbane. It was also referred to as the myth-inspiring bowl, which has led to the idea that cannabis may have also been added. The Odyssey describes it this way. Then Helen, daughter of Zeus, took other counsel. Straightway she tossed a drug into the wine they were drinking, a drug which dispels pain, calms anger, and makes men forgetful of troubles. Whoever drinks this one, when it has been mixed in the bowl, would feel no tear down his cheek for a whole day. Helen had such cunning drugs, good ones, which Thon's wife Polydamna gave her from Egypt, where the fertile earth produces the most drugs, and many are good ones mixed, but many are harmful. Here we see Hecate, the goddess of the crossroads, who had two quite distinct aspects to her personality. In the day, she was supposed to have a benign influence on farming, but during the hours of night and darkness, she was involved with witchcraft, ghosts, and tombs. Hecate is most often depicted as having 3 heads. A number of plants, often poisonous, medicinal, or psychoactive, are associated with her, including aconite, belladonna, dittany, and mandrake. She's usually seen with her 2 ghost hounds that are said to serve her. The Athenians were particularly respectful towards her, and once a month they placed offerings of food at the crossroads where her influence was thought to be the strongest. Here the 3 faces of Hecate also represent the 3 ages of women: maiden, mother, and crone. Hecate's influence was long-lasting, and medieval witches worshipped the willow tree, which was sacred to her. The same root word which gave willow and wicker also gave witch and wicked. Very like Demeter, Hecate combined fertility with death as a power of the earth, making her a feared and revered figure. The powerful sorceress Circe, known as the seductress and tormentor of Odysseus, was another of Hecate's followers. Circe was a goddess who was also a pharmakeia, a user or provider of medicine, poison, and spells. She lived with her nymph attendants on a mythical island called Aiaia. She was skilled in the magic of metamorphosis and the power of illusion, and was renowned for her vast knowledge of drugs and herbs. The poison path, or the dark side of drug plants, is emphasized in this portrait of Circe by pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones. Circe was a powerful enchantress who, with the help of herbs and incantations, could turn men into animals and create visions of beasts. She was able to darken the heavens by hiding the moon or the sun behind clouds, and she could destroy her enemies with poisons. In her presence and because of her enchantments, the woods could move, the ground could rumble, and the trees around her could turn white. But as sorcery may make a victim also of she who practices it, the nights of Circe were spent in fear because of terrible visions that filled her house. The walls and chambers of her palace could seem to be bathed in blood, while fire could seem to devour her magic herbs. And it was a relief for her when daylight came and she could bathe and clean her garments, forgetting the scary nightly visions. The daughter of the Titan Helios, Circe was banished by Zeus to her island, where she honed her magical abilities and met all manner of Greek mythological figures, from the Minotaur to Athena. When Odysseus landed on her island, Circe slipped a potion into the mixture that was given to Odysseus and his men to try to break their will, if not to kill them outright. The sailors were transformed into animals, but Odysseus had the antidote, moly, and he alone escaped. So in the Odyssey, it happens that both father and son are given psychoactive drugs supplied by women for different purposes. While Helen of Troy was consoling Telemachus, his father Odysseus was having a different kind of psychoactive experience with a strong hallucinogen. He was the only one who was not transformed by Circe's potion. Medical historians have speculated that the story of transformation to pigs was not intended literally, but refers to hallucinations that Circe's brew may have caused, and that it may have been another form of nepenthe, containing a larger percentage of strongly hallucinogenic atropa alkaloids, such as members of the nightshade family. Symptoms of anticholinergic poisoning include amnesia, hallucination, and delusion, and the description of the antidote moly fits the snowdrop, a flower of the region that contains galantamine, which is an anticholinesterase and can therefore counteract anticholinergics. Here we see the infant Comus, the son of Circe, listening to his mother's incantations. Comus is the god of festivity, revels, and nocturnal dalliance. Comus' mother, Circe, here surrounded by her female attendants, educated her son in the destructive powers of pharmaca. Circe holds in her right hand a golden goblet into which is poured a quantity of the magic potion with which Comus will bewitch his victims, and by which he will learn to overcome the virtuous resistance of ladies. Here Comus tempts a lady using his potion in the golden goblet. Here's Aegeus, the king of Athens, consulting the Pythia, the Delphic oracle. The name comes from the python, the dragon that was slain by Apollo. She's seated on a tripod. A tripod was a type of altar used by the ancient Greeks. The most famous was this Delphic tripod on which the Pythian priestess took her seat to deliver the oracles of the god. The seat was formed by a circular slab on top of the tripod on which a branch of laurel was deposited when it was unoccupied by the priestess. The Pythia was one of the great seers and oracles and was consulted by leaders for her prophecies on war, politics, and the most important societal concerns. At the temple of Apollo in Delphi, she held her divinations after becoming intoxicated by breathing fumes of unknown types. The usual theory has been that the Pythia delivered oracles in a frenzied state induced by vapors rising from a chasm in the rock itself. Others speculate that henbane, datura, or cannabis burned or vaporized on the tripod was the source of the vapors. Sometimes the Pythia preceded the inhalation of vapors by chewing laurel leaves, which contain varying amounts of cyanide, possibly sufficient enough to induce hallucinations. Most ancient civilizations or cultures used various herbs and plants in ritual, initiation, and other ceremonies, as well as for healing. Here's an Egyptian scene of ritual healing. The sick man is a pharaoh who is assisted by a queen holding in one hand 2 fruits of mandrake and in the other a bunch of blue lotus flowers. It's worthwhile to mention that the blue lotus isn't actually a lotus, it's a water lily, but we use the word lotus conveniently for familiarity. This particular flower was closely linked with the rising and setting sun for the ancient Egyptians, and it was a flower belonging to the god of the sun and of perfume. A wall painting from the New Kingdom period from a tomb dating to 1350 BC shows an Egyptian garden with date trees, grapevines, and a square pool filled with fish and flowering blue lilies. Presumably, the gardener either moved wild plants into the garden or started them from seed. The painting is evidence that blue water lilies were cultivated in gardens more than 3,000 years ago. The Egyptian blue lily, or lotus, has psychoactive properties. There's an ongoing contemporary conversation among archaeologists as to whether or not the ancient Egyptians knew of its mildly narcotic effects. It's probable that they did because lily flowers are often shown with symbols for poppies and mushrooms, both psychoactive plants. The Egyptian goddess Isis healed her brother Osiris with sacred herbs, spices, and enchantments. Resembling the Cretan poppy goddess and Demeter in her headdress of snakes and herbs, she was honored as the goddess of immortality, fertility, motherhood, and herbal cures. This is the Pleiades, a star cluster 500 light years away, known as the Seven Sisters and named by the ancient Greek for the daughters of Atlas. There are several origin stories for the Pleiades. The story that most of us know is based mainly on Greek mythology, but there are many more legends from around the world. Vedic astrologers who were users of the sacred drug soma placed them at the center of the universe. And Cherokee legends teach that their people came from the Pleiades, as do the Lakota and Dakota people. And the Dene call the Pleiadian star cluster the sparkling suns. Written in 1860, the book The Seven Sisters of Sleep by Mordecai Cook was a groundbreaking survey of the use of the 7 most popular drug plants of the Victorian era: tobacco, opium, cannabis, betel nut, coca, datura, and the amanita mushroom. Here's the first of Cook's 7 sisters, Sitaboa, or betel. The fruits of the Eureka palm tree, also known as the betel nut, contain the stimulant auricoline. Native to Southeast Asia, the nuts are ground and often combined with mineral lime and wrapped in a leaf made into a quid that's then held in the mouth. Their effect is as a mild stimulant, causing a warming sensation in the body and a slightly heightened alertness, which could be compared to drinking a cup of coffee. The second sister is Datura. Datura, belladonna, and brugmansia are all nightshades or solanaceous plants. Also included in the Solanaceae family are various potato, tomato, pepper, eggplant, and tobacco species. Atropa belladonna is one of the Solanaceae, and it can produce visions. It gets its name from its cosmetic use by women of the Italian Renaissance, and it's native to Europe, where it's also known as deadly nightshade, and contains the psychoactive alkaloids atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. The daturas are closely related cousins of belladonna. Datura inoxia, the sacred datura, is native to the American Southwest and has a long history of use among the Zuni, Diné, and others. It was made famous or infamous by Carlos Castaneda, who wrote about its use by his Yaqui teacher, Don Juan. Datura stramonium, the thorn apple or jimson weed, is mostly an eastern species which was probably introduced to the Americas from the West Indies. The brugmansias, also known as tree daturas, are tropical varieties which also have a long history of use in South America. Here the plant is represented as a beautiful woman. The man is under her power, lying down helplessly anesthetized by a poisonous essence disguised as beauty. It appears to be all over for him, the caption of this cartoon reads. Ganga, representing cannabis and hashish, is the fourth sister. Queen Victoria used cannabis for her dysmenorrhea, and it was the first internationally recognized medical cannabis patient. The fourth sister is Virginia, tobacco. The unconventional couple in this French engraving appear to be tobacco workers or figures acting as the personification of the tobacco industry. The fifth sister is erythroxylina for coca. This image is Mama Coca, introducing the divine plant of the Incas to the Spanish conquistadors. Feminine associations with the drug have continued into the modern era, and cocaine, first isolated in 1860, was popularly known as girl during the 1930s and 40s, and sometimes also as lady or white lady. The sixth sister is Amanita muscaria. Amanitas are the superstars of the mushroom kingdom, set apart by their distinctive beauty and mystical presence. If you see a mushroom in a fairy tale book, the chances are it'll be an Amanita muscaria. Amanita continues to sprout up in our culture, everywhere from video games to collectibles. In the Super Mario game, it has become one of the most iconic items in video game history, and it's almost as well known as Mario himself. Its first and most common effect is causing Mario to turn into the small Mario to turn into his super form. The last sister is morphina for the opiates, derived from the poppy Papaver somniferum, which has had a long tradition of use starting in the Neolithic era. Morphina is represented here in female form, putting all creatures to sleep. The use of the opium poppy, of course, antedates written history, and images of opium poppies have been found in ancient Sumerian artifacts from 4000 BC. The making and the use of opium was known to the ancient Minoans, and its sap was later named opion by the ancient Greeks, from where it got its modern name of opium. The use of psychoactive plants was once a common practice in Europe, and many of the identified heretics of the Inquisition were practitioners of plant-based religions. During the European witch craze, the full force of the Inquisition was brought to bear on the preparers of potions and philters, the herbalists, the cunning men and witch women of Western Europe, with a ferocity unmatched even in attempts to eradicate the practices of indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. The Inquisition was remarkably successful. By systematically eliminating the European witches and all who associated with them, supported them, defended them, or resembled them, most traces of European earth-based religions and of the identities and uses of the associated medicinal and psychoactive plants were successfully eradicated in Western Europe. Those that remained were labeled with negative markers that indicated their forbidden status, such as deadly nightshade, toadstool, and henbane. This is a Macedonian church mural which depicts the devil defecating into the mortar where this medicine woman is preparing herbs to treat a sick child. Here is a depiction of a witch with a broomstick at her departure for the Sabbath. Witches sometimes did use broomsticks, but the flight experience was probably the psychotropic effect of witches' flying ointment. The collection of Arabian and Persian folktales that forms the 1001 Nights dates back to around the 9th century. They are framed within the story of Scheherazade, the new wife of a king who believed that all women were faithless and formed the habit of marrying virgins only to have them executed the morning after the wedding. Scheherazade managed to delay this fate for 1001 nights by plying the king with hashish and telling him a compelling story each night with a cliffhanger ending so that he had to keep her alive for another day to find out how it turned out. The most famous characters include Aladdin, Sinbad, and Ali Baba. Here we see a plant-induced vision of paradise. The legend of the Old Man of the Mountains, Hassani Saba, was reported by Marco Polo, who learned of it while traveling in Persia in 1273. In his mountain fortress at Alamut, Hassan Saba supposedly drugged young men with a potent mixture of opium and hashish. Marco Polo reported that, quote, young men awoke in a fabulous garden where they were entertained by beautiful women who sang sweetly and danced in a manner charming to behold. These beautiful maidens who seduced young warriors were the Huris. With such pleasures as a reward, these men would gladly face certain death to carry out assassinations devised by their master, Hassan Saba, knowing that they'd be rewarded in paradise. Hassan Saba is the origin of the word assassin, and here we see an early image of the concept of the paradise of virgins awaiting the martyr in his afterlife. Here's an image from the Western Hemisphere, a pre-Columbian wall relief depicting a warrior receiving power from mushrooms that are being offered by the woman kneeling before him. 1,000 years of history is recorded in the Mixtec codices. This is page 24 of the Codex Vidobonensis, one of the few pre-Columbian native manuscripts which escaped the Spanish destruction. In the second row from the top, the last figure on the right, wearing the bird mask, has been identified as the wind god, Ehecatl, who is shown bestowing divine mushrooms on mankind. And here are the mushrooms. Gordon Wasson credited his Russian wife Valentina with changing him from a mycophobe who feared mushrooms to a mycophile, a lover of mushrooms. This all occurred on their honeymoon, and it's a favorite story in psychedelic history. Gordon was an East Coast banker who sought out the Mazatec curandera, Maria Sabina, in Oaxaca in 1955, and with his photographer and Valentina and her 17-year-old daughter, became the first Euro-Americans to be guided on a mushroom trip by Maria Sabina, each having a positive experience. Maria Sabina was a masterful oral poet. Here's a translation of part of one of her chants from a mushroom velada. I am wise even from the womb of my mother. I am a woman of the winds, of the water, of the paths, because I am known in heaven, because I am a doctor woman. In 1957, in a Life magazine article, Wasson referred to Maria Sabina as Eva Mendez in an attempt to protect her privacy, but the attempt failed. Youth from the United States began seeking out Maria Sabina and the magic mushrooms, and this onslaught disrupted her village and led to her arrest on more than one occasion by local federales. Mabel Ganson Evans Dodge Stern Lujan was a wealthy American patron of the arts and a member of the Greenwich Village avant-garde who became interested in peyote during the last century. Her memoirs describe her several marriages, her many affairs with both men and women, her ultimate feeling of being nobody in herself, despite years of psychoanalysis and a luxurious lifestyle on 2 continents among the leading literary, art, political, and intellectual personalities of her day. She also gave one of the first accounts of peyote experiences in white America. Mabel persuaded a friend, the ethnographer Raymond Harrington, who had lived in Oklahoma and was familiar with the rudiments of Native American church ceremonies, to help her and several friends try to replicate a peyote ceremony in her apartment in New York. Harrington's description that peyote conferred the ability to pass beyond ordinary consciousness and to see things as they are in reality excited Mabel's adventurous spirit, and when she discovered that Harrington actually had a supply of peyote, she was determined to try it. Harrington warned her that peyote was not to be taken lightly and insisted that there was a correct procedure for its use. Mabel and her friends agreed to take it according to his instructions. They fasted for 1 meal, and then they set up her drawing room with a simulated fire and a folded sheet standing in for the peyote altar. This trip with 9 friends was not a pleasant experience for Mabel, who became frightened that the police would be called after one of the participants left the apartment in a frenzy. She later wrote about this event. She was reluctant to use peyote again, but in 1917, bored with her society life and weary of the focus on military mobilization and the propaganda related to the World War, she moved to Taos, New Mexico, where she married Tony Lujan, a Taos Pueblo man who was a peyote leader in his pueblo. Lujan gave peyote medicine to his wife when she was very ill, and she had a classic transformative vision. She wrote a poetic and evocative account of her experience in which she said that the whole universe fell into place for her. Mabel Lujan used the term expansion of consciousness long before it was to become idiomatic 40 years later. Peyote, however, became a contentious issue in her marriage to Tony Lujan. She had directly experienced the healing and deep insight that was possible under its influence, but she insisted that Lujan give up the use of peyote and opposed the inclusion of peyote leaders in the Pueblo government. Along with other instances of meddling in Pueblo affairs, Mabel Lujan encouraged religious persecution of peyote users, whom she described as drug addicts, and supported the enactment of a federal law prohibiting peyote use. A wealth of expert knowledge from both anthropologists and peyote users from Oklahoma to Montana opposed this legislation, and it was quietly dropped. Before the Beatles, Timothy Leary, and Carlos Castaneda, LSD was the drug of choice for a rarefied circle of glamorous elites who ingested it as part of their psychiatric therapy sessions. We're talking about people as famous and diverse as the aquatic actress Esther Williams, Time publishers Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce, who is seen here, director Sidney Lumet, author Anais Nin, and composer Andre Previn. Claire Booth Luce's acid trips, which she recorded in her papers, which are now in the Library of Congress, were of the garden variety. She sorted mosaic glass by her swimming pool. She entertained herself looking through a kaleidoscope. During a March 11, 1959 trip, Richard Nixon telephoned Claire at her Phoenix home. An active Republican who served in Congress and as an ambassador, Claire declined to speak to Nixon. This is Anais Nin, also a member of the elite circle and treated with LSD by the same psychiatrists and researchers as the Luces. Billie Holiday, Eleonora Fagan Goff, born on April 7, 1915 in New York City, was an American jazz singer and songwriter. Nicknamed Lady Day by her loyal friend and music partner Lester Young, Holiday was a seminal influence on jazz and pop singing. Her vocal style, strongly inspired by jazz instrumentalists, paved a new way of manipulating phrasing and tempo. Above all, she was admired for her deeply personal and intimate approach to singing. The critic John Bush wrote that she had changed the art of American pop vocals forever. Billie Holiday struggled with opiate addiction most of her adult life. Because she was a successful, high-profile Black performer, she was targeted by the Bureau of Narcotics. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI repeatedly set her up and busted her. Early on, she argued that drug addiction was a medical problem, not a criminal problem, when hardly anyone else was saying it. The poet Mary Barnard is the author of an elegantly written and perceptive essay about magical and sacred plants, which appeared in the American Scholar, the magazine of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, in 1963. Barnard was a student of the origins of myth. In 1951, when she contracted hepatitis, she read Homer while she was bored and confined to bed, and began a translation of the poems of Sappho. Published in 1958, her clear and elegant translation has never been out of print and permanently changed the way that scholars approach the poetic forms of Sappho's verse. In an essay called The God in the Flower Part, Barnard discusses the relationship between folklore and a comprehensive list of sacred mind-changing plants, including peyote, varieties of datura, the Texas mountain laurel that is the so-called mescal bean, banisteria, kava, soma, coca, opium poppies, mushrooms, cannabis and hashish, bufotenine, the Delphic oracle's chewing of laurel leaves, and the Taoist hermit's use of the divine fungus ling chi. Barnard believed that the magic plants in many myths are not imaginary and that the food of occult knowledge is not a fiction. She took the position that half a dozen important mythological themes, the shaman's journey, the elixir of immortal life, the food of occult knowledge, the fate of the disembodied soul, communication with the dead, and plant deities, that they all converge on this point, on some actual food, usually a plant, ritually consumed, not symbolically, but for the experience that it confers. Barnard pointed out that the characteristic descriptions of the disembodied soul in many shamanic narratives are not just a cultural or psychological phenomenon. In many of these narratives and in firsthand descriptions of shamanic performances, we are told that the shaman takes something to encourage or to facilitate healing, divination, or prophecy. but we are not told what it is that she or he takes. Barnard suggested that this gap in understanding is due to a mixture of the shaman's reluctance to reveal sacred and secret knowledge, and to early observers' tendencies to see shamanic practice as satanic if they were religious people, and as theatrical hokum if they were skeptics. On the contrary, she said, the mythological golden apples and other elixirs, barks, roots, leaves, and ambrosias have their origins in real plants, and that talking plants really do impart occult knowledge. So this has been a brief review of some of the history of women and sacred plants. Our female predecessors in this work faced an entirely different discourse community. The image of women's place has altered drastically, even since the last major period of psychedelic research. The work of many women scholars and experimenters will possibly never be fully appreciated, as the image of what was socially right and good tended to keep them in supporting roles, even in situations where they clearly made an important and substantive contribution. One of our interests in the Women's Visionary Council is in recognizing and presenting the work of women in our field, and particularly that of women whose contribution has remained obscure. So I'm going to end by showing you some of the faces of women who are contemporary forces in this work in recognition of their contributions. This is Marlene Dobkin de Rios, Betty Grover Eisner, Lisa Bieberman, Barbara Meyerhoff, Anita Hoffman, Diane DePrima, Grace Slick, Minnie Jocelyn Elders, Brownie Mary Rothman, Gertrude Paulton, Rosemary Leary, Jean Houston, Elizabeth Gips of the Haight-Ashbury, Ann Waldman, Christina Groff, Sandra Harner, Michelle Aldrich, Carolyn Garcia, Anne Shulgin, Justine Toms, Roni Stanley, Kathleen Harrison, Annie Mithofer, Johanna Romney, Susan Boyd, Brigitte Groff, Deborah Mash, Claire Wilkins, Joan Halifax, Alicia Danforth, Raven Lang, Bia Labache, Lady Amanda Fielding, Catherine McLean, Mary Cosimano, and Valerie Corral. I salute you all, and I thank you very much for giving me this time to talk to you. Good night to everyone.